And today, I'm going to talk about the idea that doesn't Christianity exclude people. And I wanted to start with a movie clip today. We haven't quite got that figured out yet. Our technical difficulties assail us from every side. So, it's from this movie. It just popped up on Netflix a couple months ago called St. Vincent. It's got Bill Murray in it. So you already know it can't be all that bad, right? But this boy walks into his first day at a new school that happens to be a Catholic school in New York, and he's welcomed by the teacher, who happens to be a priest, and he says, well, the way that we welcome all of our new students today is by having them lead us in opening prayer. And the kid's eyes get real big, because I know a lot of you leaders who run things here at church would get the same expression on your face if I were to spring that on you too. And he says, I think I'm Jewish. and the teacher says, oh, Oliver thinks he's Jewish. What about the rest of you, class? And all of them throughout the classroom here. I'm Jewish, I'm Hindu, I'm an atheist. He's like, see, we're all kinds of things here today. And Oliver's a new one. He thinks he's Jewish. So, Oliver, it's wonderful that you're Jewish. That does not preclude you from leading the class in morning prayer. and so Oliver goes on to pray perhaps one of the most honest prayers ever depicted in film. And he says, Dear God, thank you. Amen. I think that's a keeper as prayers go. And I think that scene is a beautiful picture of inclusion. That we are all coming from different places here, but we can accept one another, and as long as we're here, I guess we might as well pray together, right? And of course, that's not how it always works out. I'll be the first to admit it, that Christianity has a long and sordid history of leaving people out and making people feel unwanted, like they're on the fringe or outside the fringe. I mean, you could go all the way back to the Crusades to start that conversation, when Christianity and government were tightly wound together, that if you were against either one of them, you were in big trouble. And that story ties right into the Inquisition and people being forced to convert and things like that, forced to be brought inside when they were on the outside. And I wish that I could say the ways that churches and Christianity have excluded people was something relegated to the annals of history on continents far away from here. But that's just not true. In the grand scheme of things, if you think about it, it wasn't all that long ago that blacks and whites worshiping in the same church on a Sunday morning would have been a scandal. There was a time when churches themselves advocated for this, when churches themselves were advocating for slavery and saying that was something God was okay with. And there are still times and places when certain types of people feel left out from the life of the church and from the love of God. And there are whole brands of Christianity that make women feel inferior, that prohibit them from serving as pastors or teachers. And there are places where if you don't dress right, if you don't believe the exact right thing, or if you're viewed as morally inferior, there are still churches all over the place that will go out of their way to help you feel like you don't belong. And just so you know, you belong here at Northern Light, even if your car alarm goes off in the middle of the sermon. You're welcome. So today, I want to take a long look at the story that gave us Christianity. All right, so this is the long view on the story of God at work in the world. And I'm going to walk us through kind of the Old Testament in about 10 minutes, and we're going to consider together whether or not God's people has a trajectory. What is the way that history is moving? Has God picked a people, and it's us and no one else? Is God tightening the circle over time so that just a few exclusive people belong? Or is the circle of God's family widening over time so that more and more people are welcomed in? So that's our project today. No big deal. So we're going to start at the beginning. Adam, maybe you've heard of him. He's the first person, all right? And Adam was God's person. So if God had any people at all, it would have to be Adam because he's the only one. And then there's Eve too. But they are the only people, and so they have this intimate relationship with God. The Bible even talks about how they go for walks in the afternoon with God through the garden. Pretty amazing. But then, of course, things don't go so well. There was some fruit involved. And that relationship gets severed and fragmented. And so God sets out on a new mission to create a new people that are formed not through this kind of close face-to-face intimacy, but through faith. And so Abraham is the first one who pops on the scene. That is God's chosen people through faith. God speaks to Abraham and says, Abraham, I want you to do this crazy thing and go far away from your father and your family and the land that you know. And trust me, I'm going to make you into a people that will be my people, that will get my blessing, and that will be a blessing to the whole world. All right? So that's the Abraham thing. It's literally one guy is where it starts. And God makes this audacious promise to him, and Abraham responds in faith. And then Abraham starts a family. Now, it's not till a few generations till it actually starts looking like a family. It takes a while for it to spread. But that family then inherits that promise that God will bless them so that they can be a blessing to the world. So the story goes on. And that family expanded. And they get lost in the weeds somewhere in the book of Exodus, between Genesis and Exodus. We kind of lose some time there. And the next thing you know, they are enslaved. They're enslaved in Egypt. And they are a whole race of people known as the Hebrews that are all in the lineage of this one guy, Abraham. Okay? Are you with me? This is the long view on the story of God's people. And that, according to the Old Testament, that's how we got the Hebrew people, the original set of God's people that God had picked, and God was telling God's story through them. So the story goes like this. It starts with one man, and that one man that expands to a family that is God's chosen people, and that expands to a whole nation that is God's people. So that's pretty good. Like if there's only one set of people that gets to be included in the set that is God's people, you've got a whole nation. However, there is still everybody else on earth who is outsiders at this point in the history of God at work in the world. So if we're talking about who gets included, it's not enough. All right? And so that's why the story doesn't end there. Throughout this story, most of humanity is on the outside. And when we get to the time of Jesus, so we're jumping ahead 1,000 or so years, this nation of Israel has been around for 1,000 years. And that's think about this. That's 4 times longer than the United States has been around. So they've got every bit as much of the political intrigue and factions that we see in our country today going on. They've had all this time for those things to develop and morph into complexity. And the religious system that had grown alongside this nation had developed too. They had developed their own insiders and outsiders, and you could tell it from the architecture of their temple. So their temple, this is not a map of their temple that's coming up here next. It's just a diagram of all the different concentric places that you could go depending on what kind of person you were. All right? So at the center, there's the most holy place. And then just outside of that, there's a place that's just the regular holy place. All right? And that's where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and that's where the high priest could only go once a year to make atonement for all the people. All right? That's at the center point, and that's a very small space. Only one person gets to go there once a year. And then just outside of that is the ring of the priests. And that's a whole subset. That's all the professional church people, all the professional temple workers and stuff. They're the only ones who can go in that ring of the temple. And outside of that, there's for the men. They call it the court of the Israelites, but they meant just the Israelite men. Just the guys can go there. All right? So, and then just outside of that, that's where the women can go. All right? And so they have their own space too. That is, in the temple. This is all kind of inside the region that is where God lives. And then just outside that, there's the court of the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are anyone who's not Jewish. So people who don't belong to this religion for whom this temple is built, there's a place for them here. So that's kind of neat. It's a far, far away place. It's very far from the center of where God lives, but it's at least on the map, right? So we've gone from saying it's us and no one else in the time of the Old Testament to there's a place for everyone, even if it's a far, far away place for some folks. So the center of this temple is where God lives, and the people of the world are in various states of closeness to God according to the map of the temple. So let's jump ahead with me a few decades. And a follower of Jesus writes the book of Revelation. And here's what Revelation chapter 7 says. I looked again. I saw a huge crowd, too huge to count. Everyone was there, all nations and tribes, all races and languages, and they were standing dressed in white robes and waving palm branches, standing before the throne. That's the throne of God, the throne and the Lamb, that's Christ himself. And heartily singing, salvation to our God on his throne, salvation to the Lamb. So that's people from every tribe and every nation all across the earth. This is a picture of everyone drawn magnetically together, bridging across every type of separator that there is. This scripture is also talking about the place where God lives, just like the temple is the place where God lives. This scripture is also talking about the place where God lives, but everyone is standing right there, from every country, men and women, and young and old, and everybody. So something between that temple from the time of Jesus' life and the writing of this book, a few decades later, something had really shifted. Something dramatically changed in the story of how God is connected to the people of the world during that short window of time. Any guesses on what that might have been? Jesus, right? That's the answer. If you're ever in doubt and I ask you a question, just say Jesus. You're on the right track. You'll be right at least 70% of the time. So something dramatically changed in the story of how God is connected to the people of the world, and that is Jesus. Paul, who writes about Jesus, puts it this way in Romans chapter 5. Consequently, just as one trespass results in condemnation for all people, that's Adam, right? From the beginning of our story. So also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. That's Jesus. For just as through the disobedience of the one man, the many were made sinners, so also through the disobedience of the one man, the many will be made. Through the obedience of the one man, the many will be made righteous. And this is God's trajectory through history. From few to many. From exclusion to inclusion. The story we find in the pages of the Bible is going somewhere. There's a direction that it's all headed. See, God always works through some subset of humanity, because that's how God's story can get told. If God were speaking to every single person all the time, then everyone would have their own story. and there wouldn't be one story we can look to and say, this is where we start. All right? So we got a story that comes out of these people. And that's how we get a story about where God is found in the world. But when God enters into that story as one of us, then he can be the subset of humanity for us all. Even though Jesus is just one person, the life he lives and the death he dies counts for us all because of the way he was utterly unique in history. So instead of God working through one man among all of humanity, God works through one man for the sake of all humanity in Jesus. So that all those barriers get torn down. God wanted so badly to include all people in the story of God's saving love that God came into the world to make that a reality. Or, in other words, for God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. Maybe you've heard that one before. I could have just skipped everything I said to this point and just read you that one sentence, but then you get out of church early and you don't want to have all that time on your hands. So I was just looking out for you. We all plan schedules, and I know some of you are enjoying a moment to catch your breath with the kids in children's church. They're getting their thing too, so that's good. God so loved the world that he entered into our story. God broke into history in a way that gods usually aren't invited. Usually when God interrupts our history, it's bad news. It's judgment. It's destruction. But in Bethlehem, it was a child who grew to become the person who changed the shape of faith itself, and how God can be found and by whom in the world. And then whosoever believes in him. That's an old-timey word that I don't think we should get rid of. Because it really adds some weight right at that moment. It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from or where you think you're going. At this moment, if you're part of the group known as whosoever, your faith is enough to connect you to the person of Jesus and the world-shaking movement that he began. So what does this mean? What does this mean for the way Christianity ought to be? Well, here's what I have to say about that. The church is never more like Christ than when it is making sacrifices for the sake of inclusion. That's what I say. That's the defining act of Jesus that Christians talk about. That's why we wear little lowercase t's around our necks, right? The cross, right? It's kind of a weird thing to do. But we do that because that is the moment where God, in God's own self, made a great sacrifice for the sake of including everyone into the story of faith and into the family of faith. And so when we are living our lives on that model, we are acting the most like Christ that we can. We think that the moments when we are the holiest are when we are in tour de force prayer meetings or when we're becoming experts in the Bible. That's generally kind of our impression. It's the people who are acting the most spiritual or acting the most knowledgeable. That those are the times when we are being the best kind of Christian. But the Pharisees, those are the religious leaders who sent Jesus to the cross. They knew the Bible better than you or I ever will. But they never would have stood up for sinners and outsiders like Jesus did. And those are the moments, those moments like that where we act out the sacrificial love of Jesus for people who are different, people who are new. That's when I am most proud to be a part of Northern Light Church. because we are a church that does that. When I see those who feel like they're on the outside looking in, and then realize they realize that they're home, that's amazing. And we have so many stories like that. I just received a thank you card in the mail from someone who said, I came to Northern Light a year ago, and when I first arrived, I didn't know heads or tails what to make of Jesus. And you showed me God's love in an amazing way. This is from someone who had been running from church their whole life and then discovered something new. There's the story of the woman who was really not sure that there was a God, but came because she thought it was a good idea to bring your kid to church. And then in encountering the love of God in you people who are here, she realized the reality of what was behind it all. And so every moment that Christianity has chosen exclusion over inclusion, we've actually been working at cross purposes with Jesus. Every time we keep people away and say, you don't belong here, we are exactly moving in the opposite direction of God's trajectory in history. And that's why I refuse. I refuse to exclude anybody based on anything ever. That's why this place is built on welcome, where it's okay if you show up in the clothes you slept in. And we won't make fun of you if you wear a suit either. You probably won't wear it the second time you come, but we won't make fun of you. So if you felt excluded by any church or any follower of Jesus at any time ever, may I speak on behalf of Christians everywhere and on behalf of Northern Life Church when I say, I'm sorry. You did not deserve that. And Christ was not speaking to you in that moment. We are actually supposed to be little Christs. That's what the word Christian means. We're all little Jesuses walking around doing the things that Jesus would do if he was wearing your skin and walking in your shoes and going to your job and dealing with your noisy neighbors. Do all of those things just the way Jesus would do. And Jesus would never let a difference between you and your neighbor keep you from showering them with God's love. So, may you step into a world full of cynicism and self-preservation with your arms wide open to people that are different from yourself. And if you've never experienced that life-changing love of God that offers us a welcome home, no matter where you're from or where you've been, I think you're on the right track. Pray with me. God, we thank you so much that whatever brings us here today, you can lead us to the center of your love. Whatever our background is, wherever our story started, it's leading us to a place of hope and grace, forgiveness and love. We ask that you would help us to be signposts in this world that point to your goodness, that point to the fact that you are on a mission to include everyone in this great, big family.